Alright, how's it going, y'all? So today, we're going to be going over a complete guide for how to set up a Synology NAS for a business. And this is really going to be focused on the core fundamental setups here that are from literally hard drive installation to have never gotten one before. I'll also touch on what units to get very briefly at the beginning here, all the way up until it is set up as a business file server. And at the end, I'm going to leave a bunch of tutorials and specific places to go because once you get that set up, there's so many other things you can do and other directions to be. It doesn't really make sense to add them all into this one video because only maybe half of them will apply to each individual person. But these Synologies are really great business file servers. They can do so much more than just be a file server, but that's what they are at their core. In my opinion, they are a phenomenal alternative to a Windows server because the Windows server alone, the license is like $2,000. So pretty much any Synology you buy will be cheaper than the Windows server license alone. And they are far easier to set up and maintain than Windows Server. It is one of those things where Windows Server and Windows Domain Controller used to be the de facto standard for every single business. And now they are kind of relics of the past, unless you're one of these massive enterprises. Because in my opinion, having a NAS rather than a Windows Domain Controller is a much better place to start that is just going to be far easier to set up and really allows business owners to actually be their own IT department rather than having to outsource it and use everything like that. It just has a way lower total cost of ownership and has a lot of great features that will make you both more secure and easier to work in a dynamic environment, such as setting up an easy VPN server and having people be able to sync files directly to their computer. All right, so before we get started with the tutorial, by the way, there's chapters down below. If you've already got your Synology, you can skip this section. We're going to touch very briefly on what Synology should you buy as a business owner. This right here is the DS923 Plus. It's got 4 bays currently and can have another 5 as an expansion unit. And this is actually the unit I would probably recommend as the bare minimum for a business. 4 bay with an upgraded CPU. It's not something I generally recommend for home users because if you're a home user, you'd probably just want to upgrade to the 1522 Plus. And in all honesty, a lot of businesses I would recommend going with the 1522 Plus over this because it's a little bit more expensive and you get a 5th bay, which can really increase the longevity of the unit. But I would start with this as the minimum and really choose between the DS923 Plus and the DS1522 Plus to start. These are both 4 and 5 bay units that have the ability to add in 10 gigabit expansion, SSD caching, and all these other extra features. So it means that it is upgradable down the line should you need it. I don't really recommend getting a 2 bay unless you know you're only ever going to need a very small amount of data and that's never going to change, just because 2 bays very quickly get filled up and there's not an easy way to expand them. What I generally recommend people do is get a 4 or 5 bay NAS and stick 2 hard drives in there in a RAID 1 or SHR1 array. Those 2 drives are going to start by mirroring each other, so you're going to lose half your space. So you're only going to get the space of 1 drive. So if today you need probably 8 terabytes, I would probably get 2 16 terabyte drives. That way, you start off only about 50% full, and if you can spend for it, get a third 16 terabyte drive. Ideally, you keep your NAS under about 50% full. The kind of harder line for that is about 80% full. I would really recommend at all times keeping it below 80% full, but that's where I would start. A really nice thing about this is you can just add in another drive of the same size or larger and just hit expand, and over the course of a few days, boom, now you're going to get that extra space. And so I would really recommend doing that. Obviously, if you have a lot more data than that, a great unit for this is the DS1821 Plus that can have 108 terabytes in it. So that is a great place for larger businesses. And then from there, the sky is the limit. I just want to touch on that briefly here because I know people are going to be asking. One thing I would also recommend getting if you do have the budget for it and you are going to be putting more than about 5 terabytes on one of these things, right off the bat, get a second NAS and set it up as an offsite backup. You can set it up to back up to your house. And so that way, every night, every file that's changed on the main NAS gets backed up to your house or any other place. That way, if anything happens to the office NAS, you can just drive home, pick it up, bring it in the office, and get everybody back up and running. It is something that, yes, there's a hardware cost associated with it, but for a lot of businesses with physical presence, it will pay for itself very quickly because it is so cheap. Being down for even a couple days is something that's incredibly expensive for businesses, and hardware is really pretty cheap. So I would really recommend looking into that. I'm not going to go over it here directly. I'm going to talk about backup methods at the end of this video. But if you can, get a second identical NAS and set it up as an offsite backup. It's a really great use of money. All right, so with all that out of the way, let's go ahead and talk about setting this thing up. So I'm not going to go over it super in depth here, but you can see on the front of pretty much all NASs, they have these little trays. Depending on the type they are, they either push in and pop out, or you just pull out and they come out. This one already has a hard drive in it. And these are the 3.5-inch hard drives. So these are the big ones that fit fully in the tray. You can also buy SSDs, and there are 4 screws that you put in to mount an SSD. Essentially, the way you actually put hard drives in one of these things is pretty simple. You pull the tray out, and then you'll notice there are these 2 tabs, one on either side. All you do is you go to the top that goes into the unit, and you'll see there's a little pull lever. Just pull it out on both sides. This actually is essentially a fake screw, so that way you don't have to screw the hard drives in. Instead, those kind of screw them in by having the little plastic nub. So you stick the hard drive in, it only goes in one way. The metal teeth should be the side that goes in and should be on the side closer to the black plastic. If these pieces go in, you know it's correct. And you simply just put them back in. And now your hard drive should be secure. After you've done that with all your hard drives, simply put them on in. If you've gotten an SSD cache or RAM upgrade, you can go ahead and install that as well. And if you've upgraded your networking card, you can also install all that before setting up the first time. Those specifically people who have upgraded the network card during this very first time setup, go ahead and keep it into one of the built-in ports. So plug your network into one of the built-in ports to start, just for this first time setup. I'll talk about that in a minute here. But essentially go in and get everything in the unit. And then once you've got everything hooked up, go ahead and just plug it into both power and your Wi-Fi router. Or if you've got a switch, you can do that as well. When you're plugging the unit into the Ethernet port, you only need to set up one of them for now, unless you've got another case. But to start, just have one Ethernet cable, unless you have a specific reason you know about using that second Ethernet cable for. Your NAS will either come with 2 or 4 Ethernet ports on the back of it. And if you did do a 10 gigabit add-in card for this first time setup, plug the Ethernet cable into the built-in 1 gigabit ports. Once you've got power and Ethernet hooked up, just hit the power button and it should flash blue and you should hear the drives starting to crank up. And so we're just going to wait a minute until we hear the first beep, and then we're going to grab our computer. By the way, while this is running, if you'd like to hire me for consulting, I do this full time. I can either manage your full IT business, or you can also just hire me for one-off projects and setting things up. I often do calls just to make sure everything's set up and working. There's a link for that down in the description below. All right, so there was the first beep. So once you hear the first beep, you're going to go ahead and open up a web browser on a computer that's on the same local network as the NAS. It can also be on Wi-Fi. And you're going to go to find.synology.com, which will actually redirect you to finds.synology.com. No idea why they changed it. I'm sure it was hard-coded somewhere. It's going to take a second to search. And once we pop this up, you're going to see some blurred out ones on my unit because I've got a lot of NASs on my local network, but you likely will just have a single one. So this is exactly what it should look like for you. It should say status not installed, and your model number hopefully is the one that you're expecting. Once you find that, hit connect and go through the basic first time setups. All right, just go ahead and hit install. We're going to automatically download and install the latest DSM. And this will format all the drives on the unit. If you were trying to migrate from an old file server and put the same drives in, back up your data and make sure you restore it. But when we do this, all the data that's on the drives that are in there will be formatted. For most people, you're getting fresh drives anyway, so it's not a big deal. You probably will not get this section. This is because I have formatted this thing so many times and changed the model number a couple times. So it's still got data on there. So that's why I got that menu, funny enough. And now it's going to go ahead and just install. It's just going to take a minute, and we're just essentially going to wait this out until we hear the next beep. While we are waiting for this, I do want to mention a couple of things, just good housekeeping things to know about using the NAS. So one, people who are in the same local network as the NAS are going to have the best experience. But if you're using just PDF files and Word documents over a VPN server, most people will not even know the slowdown if they're in the same geographic area, the same country. Another thing is, if you're using the NAS to store large photos, videos, things like that, people who are working on those projects will really have a much better experience if they're wired. So I would really recommend investing in a wired Ethernet switch if you can get one. They're very cheap, and to start, 1 gigabit is a huge upgrade over Wi-Fi for people who are going to be using large files. You can get really cheap dongles that'll hook up Ethernet into laptops, and most docking stations also come with a built-in Ethernet port. It's one of those things that is a minor upgrade in terms of cost, but will make the NAS a lot more usable. But if you're just storing Word documents and the occasional image, a lot of times your users won't even know the difference between wired Ethernet and Wi-Fi for those things for smaller files. So it's not fully required. It's really based off of your workflow, though in general, I would recommend it if it's not too big of a deal for you. Another thing I would recommend doing, if you want remote employees to be able to access this NAS, and if you can do it, it's a great thing to do anyway, is log into your router's login page and give your NAS what's called a DHCP reservation. A DHCP reservation, and a static IP address can work for this as well, essentially means that the NAS always gets the same IP address on the local network. So every single time the NAS boots up, the router will say, hey, you are 10.30.0.197 in this case. That is something that's very useful to have when you are using other services other than just the standard file server, when you're starting to access it remotely, and a bunch of things like that. So I would really recommend setting that up right off the bat if you can do it. Simply just Google DHCP reservation and whatever the name of your Wi-Fi router is, and hopefully there will be a pretty easy article on setting that up. We just heard the second beep, so now this should be just about ready for us to set up our username and password and our other basic pieces here. All right, so here we can go ahead and start our install. Come up with a name. This is going to be what shows up on the network as the computer's name, and come up with an administrator account. If you are not super tech savvy and you don't have a ton of employees, just make this your name. If you do a lot of IT stuff and you've got a fair amount of employees in different security groups, I would recommend making this your name _admin, and then we can give you a regular user account for security. It's not something that's crucial, especially now that there's the ability to do something called immutable snapshots. But if you can do it, it's a great idea to separate out you as an administrator versus you as a user, because that way you're always wearing the proper hat. Though, if you're really looking for a very simple setup, this does add a true amount of complexity, especially for people who are new to these things. And so for this simple setup, we're just going to use our first name. And you can also use your first name, last name, whatever you do whenever you're creating user accounts. This is going to be your username whenever you connect to the NAS as an administrator. And come up with a password. And then you can say allow this to be displayed in Web Assistant. Up to you. I normally leave it enabled. Now it's going to give us an option for how we would like to update our Synology NAS. I generally recommend automatically install important DSM updates and packages. So that way, if there's a security update, it automatically gets pushed, but it will not automatically update just to the newest version always, which honestly for a NAS, your goal is for this thing to be boring. I would recommend leaving it at this and then coming in and doing an update, maybe once a year. Now we can go ahead and sign into a Synology.com account. This is something that confuses people pretty often because you kind of end up with two different accounts. This is a Synology.com account that links your NAS to your email address. This gives you a couple of useful features such as Quick Connect and Active Insight. So we're going to go ahead and sign in here. I would really recommend doing this. You're going to see this blurred out because this is my account. Well, actually, it's just will@spacerex.co. And now it is linked on up. For now, we are going to skip the Quick Connect ID. And generally what I would recommend doing is enable Active Insight and the backups. Awesome. So now we have installed DSM. It's going to try to install a few things right off the bat. We're going to say no thanks and do this all manually. Up to you if you want to do the extended warranty. I never do it. Two-factor authentication, we're going to talk about that in a minute here. So we're going to say no thanks for now. What it is going to set us up for is adaptive MFA, which is very good. So adaptive MFA is basically 90% as good as two-factor authentication. What adaptive MFA does is if you're logging into the NAS with an administrator account outside of the local network, it's going to do just like your bank does and sends you an email. And I think that's a good place for a lot of people to start because two-factor does have an extra layer of annoyance to it, and you do have to be set up with an email server to do that. So we're going to say got it. Now it's going to have us just go ahead and create our first storage pool. I have 4 hard drives in here, so I've got a few different options. I would not recommend setting up RAID 10. Very, very, very few use cases in today's age require RAID 10. It is not something I would recommend doing. If you are getting less than 16 terabyte drives and performance is not key to you, SHR and SHR2 are great. If performance is really critical for you and you've got 16 terabyte drives or larger, do RAID 5 or RAID 6. I'll leave a link down in the description below for what RAID you should use. To go really, really, really quick off the bat, SHR1, essentially always make sure you've got 1 drive of fault tolerance. So if you've got 3 drives, you can lose any one of them and still keep all your data at the cost of 1 drive worth of space. SHR2, same thing, but 2 drives. Really, they're actually just a magical behind the scenes mapping of RAID 1, 5, and 6, depending on the use case. They do have a little bit of a performance overhead, but they also do give you the ability to use different size drives to still get more of your space. I'm not going to go into it super in depth here, but in general for businesses, unless you start off by buying smaller like 8 terabyte drives, I would go RAID 5 until you've got your 7th drive. And at 7th drive, I generally do RAID 6. But it's a lot of interesting use cases. If you have less than 16 terabyte drives, the same thing applies, except use SHR and SHR2 when I said RAID 5 and RAID 6. If you have 2 drives, RAID 1 will be your only option, or SHR. I'm going to go ahead and set this up with RAID 5. It's now going to let us pick our drives. Often you will see this message pop up. Don't worry about it. Honestly, they have not had a great compatibility list since they started launching their drives. I'm not going to get into that here. We have just created our storage pool. We can now create our volume. In general, you only are going to have 1 storage pool and 1 volume. In very few cases is there an exception for that, like if you've got mixed SSD and HDDs. But for most people, unless you have a specific use case, we're going to go ahead and max this thing on out. BTRFS, 0 questions about it. Now is the option to encrypt this volume. If you are storing sensitive information, I would recommend using full volume encryption here. But you need to make sure that the key that it auto downloads is something that is going to be safe and you're going to be able to find it in 10 years, guaranteed. If you are somebody who is going to likely misplace this and you don't have a great IT structure and a bunch of other things like that, don't do this unless you can guarantee that you will have this key in 10 years. It's going to be a file. And you need to make sure you have this because if something happens and you have to switch the NAS to a new unit or anything like that, you're going to need this key to unlock your data. Otherwise, it's just scrambled bits. I've genuinely seen on multiple occasions people having this issue where they lose all of their data because they can't find the encryption key. Only do this if you know you're going to be able to keep this in 10 years. I cannot stress that enough. We're going to go ahead and do it for this case. And we're going to come up with a password here. This password is just what manages your vault. It is not actually something you need to get the encryption key back. Now, when we hit apply, we're going to see that key download, and it's literally going to tell you, yes, I have received the key. You saw it download up there, and I will keep it safe. Do not take that lightly. Perfect. Now we are building our volume, and our volume is essentially where we're going to store all of our data. All right, so now for users who added in a upgraded 10 gigabit network card or higher, and you had plugged in the 1 gigabit card, Now go ahead and you can plug this into the 10 gigabit network now because we are fully installed, so all of our drivers should be there. Then just come back in here. The IP address will likely change, so you may have to go back to find.synology.com. Okay, so now we are all set up and we can see we have our volume. I'm going to go through and set up a few really useful pieces here that you can kind of set and forget. The first one is one of the most crucial, data scrubbing. Data scrubbing essentially will read all the files on your NAS every 3 months and automatically fix them if they are corrupted. BTRFS can survive 1 bit of error per section of disk, so that means that it can essentially automatically fix any files that are corrupted. As long as they're not too corrupted, every time you open a file, it actually checks this corruption, but it's a good idea to run this every 3 months to make sure that all the files you've not read get read and checked for errors and auto-repaired if it's applicable. So I say repeat every 3 months. And you can also run it only during specific periods, generally outside of business hours. In all honesty, this is something that takes a very short amount of time to actually complete, so you can be very restrictive of it. As long as you give it about maybe 5 hours a week at least, it should be fine with smaller volumes, 15 for larger ones. It just has to complete every 3 months. And since we have just set this up, we can say run later. But if you're going back and you've already set up this, go ahead and run it ASAP. We are also going to come in here and under settings, we're going to hit never for record file access time. Perfect. And so now one last thing we're going to go ahead and do is go into our HDSTD test. And we're going to go ahead and create a basic task that is a quick smart test once a month. Quick test, all supported drives, monthly. You can do it extended. I personally have never found an extended to be useful. I've never seen any data out of that I didn't see out of a quick test. So I would recommend just using a quick smart test. And if you suspect a drive is dying, that's when an extended smart test can be useful. So that is all set up for the pool. And those are things you just really forget about, which is perfect. Now we're going to come into control panel and we are going to set up a few key settings. First, right off the bat, notification. Go ahead and tick this because what this is going to allow you to do is this is going to make sure you get critical email notifications to your account, even if the mail server that you hook up on the Synology breaks, because this goes through Synology.com. The Synology can also set up an email server for things like new user passwords, password resets, other notifications, two-factor, all those things. So you can set that up here. I would not recommend using the Gmail one because, quite frankly, Gmail will change its authentication requirements and it will no longer work. And then you'll not have emails for a while and you'll realize it. I would really recommend setting up an SMTP mail server. You can get them on AWS or both MS365 and Google Workspace allow you to set one up through there. So whoever you got your emails through, do that. If you can't set this up, it is not a huge deal because now they've got the mail server, which is really nice. So don't worry about it too much. Don't go out of your way to break a bunch of stuff to make this happen. But it is a nice to have to enable true two-factor authentication. If you are able to set that up, I would come into security, account, and enable two-factor authentication for either the administrators or all users, up to you and depending on how good your users are. But if you can't set up a reliable mail server, keep it on adaptive MFA. While we're in the security tab, we're going to go into protection and make sure that we enable auto block. And I personally will leave a expiration at 2 days, just in case, because stuff happens and people get blocked and it's nice to be on vacation and accidentally block yourself for whatever reason and have at least a path forward. A lot of people will want to set up 5 attempts within 1 minute or something similar. Don't touch these unless you have a really good use case for it. These are actually very secure and would take a very long time to brute force. When it comes to password guessing, there's really 2 things. They either know the password or they don't. So if they know the password, this is not going to get them. But if they don't know the password, this would take 2.5 million years to have a 50% chance of brute forcing. So it's one of those things Don't touch these defaults. These are great defaults. And a lot of people will lock themselves out because they said, oh, you tried 2 login attempts. We're going to lock you out. It's going to make your users hate you. And just hit apply. Firewall, you likely do not need to set up. Your router should be your firewall. But if you have a specific use case or this is directly hooked up to the internet, that's when a firewall can make sense. But until you really know what you're doing, leave the firewall disabled. Your router should be your firewall. We are also going to come into our hardware and power. And there's a couple of things we want to do here. First off, I always recommend, for businesses especially, restart automatically when power supply issue is fixed. Power goes out, NAS will automatically boot when it comes back on. And in that same vein, I would recommend getting a smart UPS. A UPS is a battery backup, so if your power goes out, it can power the NAS. A smart UPS is one with a USB port on it that'll tell the NAS, hey, power's out. And that way it'll shut itself down after 5 minutes. So I would recommend coming in here, saying, plug in your UPS and saying, hey, after the power has been out for 5 minutes, go ahead and just shut down. And that way, if your power goes out, honestly, people aren't going to be working after 5 minutes anyway. Everybody has time to save all their stuff. And sometimes UPSs say they can last for another 30 minutes and then die. So it's just better to say 5 minutes, go ahead and shut off. UPSs are not strictly required, but I would highly recommend getting them. They can really help protect your data. All right, and now we've just got a couple other things to just set up here, and that is going to be our tasks. Oh, gotta save that. So we're going to go down into our task scheduler, and we're going to create an additional task for emptying the recycling bin. It's funny, but you would not believe how long files end up in there and how many people have failed to create a empty bin task and have had 5 years worth of files, and they think they need to upgrade to a new NAS because they're running out of space. So we're just going to say empty bin. And for our schedule, we're going to run every night. And we're going to say any files that have been in the recycling bin for more than 7 days, go ahead and just delete. And trust me, 7 days is more than enough time for this. This is actually overkill. We are going to have a better option for retaining files called snapshots that we're about to set up here. All right, so now this is where I would recommend hooking this up to your domain controller if you've got one. So if you've got a domain controller or a LDAP server for user authentication, you can go ahead and join it right now, and you don't have to add your users in here manually. Now, for most people who don't have a Windows domain controller, and this is just their only server in their office, that's most people, go into users and group, and you want to make sure both guest and admin are always disabled. And we're actually going to go ahead and skip over users and go straight to our group. And this is really important for businesses, especially with more than maybe 10 people. Groups are where you're going to want to kind of keep everybody. You don't want to have to remember, oh, this person has access to this folder, this and this. Instead, if you right off the bat go through and create security groups, essentially just say, okay, this group should have access to these things, this group should have access to these things, it can make your life a lot easier. This is just going to be an example, but I'm just going to create 3 groups right off the bat. Management. Oh, I could spell it right. They have access to all the shared folders. We don't have any users yet, so you can skip through these. Same thing with folders. So we're just going to spam right through it. So management, that's going to be the top level, has access to everything. HR is a common one. We're just going to kind of have the foundation here. 3 different levels of permission: management, HR, and finally employees. You can also create one for contractors. That is up to you. But for most people, this is kind of an easy place to start. Obviously, tailor this to whatever makes sense for you. If you've got 5 of these, you've got 5 of these. It's really however you want to be able to section stuff off. And think about what your files are and who should have access to what. You can always manually set up, okay, this one person is a special case. They're in HR, but they also need access to this. That's okay. But for the most part, it's much better if you can go in and think of, okay, these are all the groups, and these are the different files that I'm going to have and the different permissions associated with them. So I would actually spend some time writing that stuff out and thinking of a good file system and a good permission hierarchy before actually going on the next step. So think about what kind of files do you have and what people need to access which. If you end up with more than 5 different groups of files, you're going to want to actually just use one share and advanced share permissions. I will leave a link down in the description below for that. But for people who have 5 or less, it is way easier just to have a specific share for every single one of those permission sets. So for our case, we've really got 3 different folders. Basically, our general folder, you can call it the company drive, the shared drive. Then I like to have an HR drive. It's really up to however it actually makes sense for you. But those are things that additional people have access to who are in HR, who have sensitive information, and management who would have access to everything. Remember, you can tailor this however you want to, but what we're going to do is we're going to create different shares, which are essentially different external hard drives to people's computers that will have the different permissions. I generally recommend keeping this to 5 or less for businesses for simplicity's sake. So now let's go ahead and create those. What we're going to do is we're going to start by calling it the share. You can call it the S drive. That's what a lot of people end up doing. And then it is up to you if you want to allow non-administrators to see the recycling bin. In general, I would recommend it. Okay, so this is just our general company share. All employees are going to have access to it, and probably most stuff is going to end up in here. So this is stuff that everybody needs access to, and where most people are going to be operating on a daily basis. We don't need to encrypt it here because it's already encrypted, and I would really not recommend setting this up with a write once. We do want to enable checksum because this will help protect your data in the long term. And compression is likely not necessary. Your biggest files are already compressed, more likely than not. So now we're going to get to choose our permission. And instead of choosing it based off of our users, we're going to do it based off of our groups. And if you've got a LDAP server here or Active Directory, you can also use your Active Directory. So who do we want access to this S drive? Well, everybody pretty much. So all of our employees, HR, and management. There's kind of 2 schools of thought you can have with this. You can either add every single person into employees because everybody's an employee, and therefore it would be redundant to add these, but we're going to make this overly explicit here because it's simpler to understand for new users. I would not recommend using the no access column unless you have a very specific reason to. No access will override everything else. So if somebody's in a group that has no access and a group that's read-write, they will get no access. But you can see by default, nobody has access to anything anyway, so no access should very rarely be used. Read-only can be used if required. Perfect, so we've got our S drive, and now we're going to create our 2 additional folders in the same vein. We're going to call this HR. So this is the drive that is protected because only HR and our exec team have access to it. So here we're going to say employees don't have access to it unless they're part of HR or management. And finally, you can call this management. I cannot spell management, can I? So this would be only management have access to this. So this is pretty much how you would want to set that up. So now we've got our 3 drives, and you can always check the permissions to them by just coming in and hitting edit, permissions, and just seeing the groups and the users who have access to them. It's a great thing to kind of do an audit. It is very useful for being able to tell what is going on. So now, just start creating your users. In an ideal world, all of your users will fit into those 3 categories. So I'm just going to create one called Bob. If you did set up your email server earlier, you would actually be able to just hit this, send a notification mail to the newly created user, and it would actually allow the user to just reset their own password. Really great thing to have. Now, we're just going to add everybody to the applicable group. I would recommend adding every employee to the employees group. It's going to make your life easier down the line. And that's all Bob is. And look, perfect. They have access to the S drive, but nothing else. And because we did everything on the groups, we don't have to do any custom configuration. All we have to do is add the users. And Sally's going to be in HR. So Sally is both an employee and is also in HR. Boom, there, all the permissions come through. This is the easiest way of doing it. And so on and so forth. Really useful to get set up, and you can either assign them a password, have them come over and create their own password here, or they can actually sign in themselves and change their password later on. And so now we've got our users, our folders, and our groups set up. We are ready to go. Technically, this is an active file server. You can go to races. There's going to be one thing we really need to do first at a bare minimum, and that is going to be snapshots. Because snapshots are your ransomware protection to an awesome extent. This is going to let you undo anything that somebody does. If somebody accidentally deletes the wrong folder or corrupts a file or gets a virus on their computer, you can easily undo that here. So we're going to go into Snapshots in the Package Center and just install Snapshot Replication. All right, once it's installed, go ahead and open on up. And what we're going to do is we are going to just set up a schedule for these folders by going to Snapshots, selecting all your shared folders. By the way, if you add another shared folder down the line, make sure to come back here and add this in. And we're just going to create a schedule. So think of Snapshots like a recycling bin on steroids. It is going to give you the ability to go back in time and view how files were, and they're read-only, so your users can't possibly mess them up. So we are going to go in, and for most businesses, I would recommend start when everybody's in the office, maybe 8 a.m., and then every hour until people leave. So you're going to have every day from 8 to 8, you're going to have a snapshot every hour. And so that is a point in time that you can restore to. Now, for businesses, unless you're a video production house and you're likely to run out of space, enable immutable snapshots. And we'll set these for 14 days. This means if somebody gets that admin username and password, they cannot delete these snapshots for 14 days. Regular users won't be able to delete them pretty much at all. We'll set up a schedule here in the retention settings, but this is really useful for ransomware protection. So literally your admin user credentials could get leaked and you would be able to undo this. Now we're going to go into our retention settings, and this is going to say how long we want to keep these snapshots. In general, I would recommend advanced and keeping all snapshots for 14 days. The next ones are where we go. Normally, I would keep a version of the day for the past 30 to 60 days, depending on what your files are. If these are just Word documents, 60 or 90 is easy. If you're talking about larger files that are edited significantly, 30 can be good. And now keep a snapshot of the week for maybe the past year. You can really do this for how long you would like to keep previous versions of files. What this is going to cost you in terms of space is from the moment you delete a file to the moment your space back will be the longest version of this. So in this case, it would be 52 weeks. So if I deleted a file today, a year later, I would get that space back. So if it was a 1 gig file, I would not get that 1 gig back until a year from now when it automatically expires. This is up to you. You can always come in here with a little bit of a longer policy to start. And if you start running out of space, you can go ahead and restrain this down. If you're very rarely deleting files, these will not take up much space at all. And finally, we're going to make them visible. This will allow users to see previous versions of files. You can choose to disable that here, but I really recommend enabling it because it makes your life way easier as an administrator. All right, so now the basics are done here. So if you did set up a static IP address, like I talked about earlier, I would recommend using that to mount everybody's drives. There's two different ways of doing it, one on Mac, one on Windows. So on Mac, what you're going to do is you're going to have your users go to Go, connect to server, and type in the IP address, smb://. This is 10.30.0.107. So this is how your users will connect. if you are on macOS and you want to eventually have a VPN set up. If everybody's just going to be accessing them locally, you can actually just go into Finder, scroll on down right here, network, and you will just see it listed out as the name that you set it up with. But we're going to do it directly, then put in their username and password, and they will see all the files. They can double click on it, and boom, now it is a share. And that is how they will do it. For Windows, I will leave a link down in the description below. It's very easy. You essentially map them as drive letters. So if you did do that DHCP reservation I talked about earlier, I would recommend doing // in the Windows File Explorer window, that IP address, and then connecting. After that, you can map them to the drive letters. I would recommend mapping everybody's drive letters to the same drives. And that way, when you inevitably get a VPN server, when they go home, those will just automatically connect as well. Really useful thing to do now, and it makes it much easier down the line. I will leave a link down in the description below for how to set that up though. And this right here is pretty much it. We can go in and we can just connect all of these different folders and access all the files as required. I would actually recommend setting some time to actually kind of organize this out, because if you start with a good template, your employees will just do better in my experience. So go in and really set that up. Now, there's a couple of useful things to do. I do want to show you how to set up these snapshots and really use them. So I just added a file to the S drive. I'm just going to manually take a couple of snapshots here. It just kind of helps see them. This is really going to be your best friend. So I just took 2 manual snapshots there. Really, they're going to be taken every hour, but just for the sake of this video, to demo it. So I then go ahead and modify a file, delete it, whatever. So now, if this was a recycling bin, perfect. I deleted it, so it does go in the recycling bin. But let's say it was not a delete. Let's say it was actually a modify. So for example, maybe I changed the name. Maybe I went in and it's a Photoshop document. I flattened the layers. Maybe it was a Word document and somebody saved over my edits. Well, that's stuff that does not end up in the recycling bin, because modifies are not deletes, so they don't end up in the recycling bin. This is where snapshots come in. If you go into the snapshot folder, you are going to see a list of timestamps. Click on the one that has the file as you liked it. Oh, there it is. And then you can just copy it out of the past into the present. Now, even if I'm an administrator, I also can't delete this. I can't modify snapshots because they're read only. So if somebody gets a virus on their computer, this can be used to instantaneously undo ransomware, which is really, really, really powerful, and why every single share for a business needs to have this, because it allows anything to happen and you to be able to undo it. It's really powerful. You're going to forget about it until you need it, and then it's there. I go over that much more in depth in another video. I did really want to touch on it here. The next thing I do want to talk about is a couple of things that'll make your life a little bit easier. People will always be putting files in the wrong places and doing the wrong thing. It happens all the time. This is where logs are really useful. So unless you're a video production house doing crazy stuff and you need to maximize your throughput, I would recommend coming to your SMB settings, going to your log settings, and pretty much adding in logs for everything but read. You probably don't need read unless you're a very, very, very secure business and you really want to make sure that you know exactly what people read. In general, this right here is very useful, and specifically this move will be great because people will always be dragging one file into the wrong place, and this will help you figure out what happened. It does have a little bit of throughput limitation because now it has to log every time something happens, but in general, you should be fine and you probably will not notice it. Another useful thing here is the fast clone that I would recommend enabling. It allows people to basically copy and paste a file, and it instant copies and does not take up duplicative space. Finally, if you'd like to set up a folder that is just not visible to everybody, you can come in here and actually say, hide this folder in my network places. And that way it won't show up on that other screen. People have to manually type in the address to get to it. I'm just throwing out some things here that are useful to know. All right, So those are the really basic parts of setting up the file server. And this thing can do so much more. I'm going to talk about that later. But the one thing we really need to set up as well is a backup. So there's a few different ways you can do this. In general, businesses should achieve a 3-2-1 backup solution if at all possible. 3 total copies of your data, 2 of them on-site, 1 of them off-site. That's generally how I like to set up a 3-2-1 backup solution. Especially, it's important to have them across 2 different storage media. That's the old way of it. Now it's really 2 different ways they're set up. So you don't really want both of your backups to be the exact same way, because now if that thing was silently failing for some reason, you don't want your on-site and your off-site to both fail. Instead, it's great if you can set it up in 2 different ways. For your off-site backup, in general, I would recommend setting up Hyper Backup. Hyper Backup can do a bunch of stuff. It can go to a cloud, a USB drive, pretty much anything under the sun, or another NAS. If you're going to have more than about 5 terabytes, I would really recommend just getting a second NAS and backing up to that, because it'll pay for itself pretty quickly. But if you're a small office and you've only got maybe 1 terabyte of files, you can pay $6, $7 a month to back up all your files to the cloud. So you come into Hyper Backup and choose what you want to back up. Seriously, set this up. If you don't have a huge budget, you at least need 1 backup. RAID is not a backup. You at least need 1 backup. A great place to start that's fairly inexpensive is a USB external hard drive. Leave it plugged in the NAS 24/7 and have it automatically back up every night. It is not perfect. It won't survive your office burning down, but it's there. It can be really, really useful to have. And it allows you to restore fairly quickly. I'm not going to go into that super in depth here, but I will leave a link down in the description below to how to set that up. All right, so now we have gone over a ton of this stuff. There are still so many more things you can do to use this to more and more of your ability. I'm going to leave a link down in the description below to a bunch of these tutorials, and I'm just going to pull up my YouTube page and go over other videos I'd recommend checking out. All right, so here's a good list of next places to start. If you've not bought your Synology, I've got this, but you probably don't need it. The next one I would really recommend checking out is your remote access guide. This is if you want to be able to access files outside the local network. This is where you want to check out. It will go over the Quick Connect. We did not go over it here, but it will be gone over there. Quick Connect is very useful to have, but does have some security implications to it. So check out this video before enabling Quick Connect. Synology Drive is also very useful. If you're having speed issues, this can be useful, really only for 10 gigabit connections. How to secure your NAS. It is in the older DSM, but most of that stuff does apply very well, though we did go through the vast majority of these here, so you probably don't need that. Next one up is going to be the backup methods and options. I really go in depth here on how to back up your NAS and which options are better for you. And then once you kind of pick which option, there's the backup guide for how to use that. Next up, if you're trying to host your own mail server on the Synology, watch this video first, because it is not something I would recommend doing in general. This is that Windows File Explorer video I was talking about. So this is how your users will be mapping your drive right here. Another great one is Active Backup for Business for both MS365, Google Workspace, and computers. Check this one out. You can back up all your Windows PCs for free to the NAS. Really, really, really powerful. It's awesome. This is that SHR versus RAID that goes over which the two of them are. And that is, for the most part, what I would recommend checking out. Those are all of your pieces that you really want to know. I don't think there's too much over here that is necessary. No, I was missing it. Right here, this is the ultimate BTRFS snapshot guide. It is long, but it's very useful. Snapshots are going to be your best friend. That is not hyperbole. That is absolutely true. It will really help save your business. It is the difference between a, oh, let's fix that really quick, and a, okay, we got to contact suppliers. Like, cannot stress enough how important snapshots are, because they will save your business. And finally, your ransomware protection right here, though a lot of that I did go over here. All right, So those are the videos to check out. I'll leave a link down to all those down in the description below. And if you want to hire me, as I said earlier, there's a link for that down in the description below. All right, have a good one. Bye.